Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our college planning webinar. We're going to wait for a couple more minutes and allow a few more people to join us. Hope everybody's having a great morning so far. Great. We have lots of people tuning in this morning to hear about college planning, and I think that this is going to be a fantastic presentation that will get everybody ready for college, whether you have somebody in middle school or in high school. There's going to be some great information this morning that Dave is going to share with us. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce everybody to our president and CEO. If you don't already know her, Deanne Rosso is a graduate of the University of Georgia. She joined us at Elevate, which used to be Vickery Financial Services, in 2005, and then took the company over in 2008 as president and CEO. She and her husband, Brandon, have 3 adorable boys, and they're quite a ways away from college, but I know that they're all going to be getting ready to cheer on the dogs against Clemson this weekend. So Deanne, I will let you take it away.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. As Betsy mentioned, I'm Deanne Rosso, President and CEO of Elevate Wealth Advisory. That name is new, rolling off the tongue. I have to get used to saying it. We've been Vickery Financial since 1982 and decided in 2019 that we wanted to refresh our brand and just to move ahead with what we believe is our mission in the firm. And to refresh your memory on our mission in the firm, that is to provide our clients with the tools and resources to help confidently live their best lives. And with that in regard, we decided to change our name to Elevate Wealth Advisory effective just a few weeks ago. So I'm still getting used to it. But we're excited about that. We're excited for all of your support for that rebrand. And we look forward to the future as Elevate. But today, as Betsy mentioned, I wore my college alma mater colors today in excitement for what's to come, not only with this weekend's college football kickoff, although college football kicked off last weekend with a few games that was fun, but for Georgia, we kick off this weekend, and I'm excited about that. But also just in the spirit of college planning. So one of our, as I just mentioned, with the mission of Elevate Wealth Advisory to provide some tools and resources. And one of those resources is college planning. And so today we have a very special guest panelist with us, Dave Ressner. Dave Ressner is a wealth advisor at Buckingham Strategic Wealth. And he enjoys advising families on the financial aspects of college planning because educating children, and I love this, is the perfect storm of high cost and high emotion. And I have to agree with that, Dave. I've seen that over and over, and we're excited to help to hear what you have to share with us today. Dave believes that by knowing how colleges operate, we are able to guide students to truly formative college experiences while making sure that the cost of college does not jeopardize parents' long-term financial plans. And of course, us as planners, we think that's really important too. So I will let Dave take it from here. You all should have received an outline for his presentation today, which will make it a lot easier so that we don't have to take notes throughout, although I know I'll still probably scribble some. So Dave, welcome.
Thank you, Deanne. Really honored to be here and collaborate with you on this for your clients and other guests. Yeah, like Deanne said, it is college planning is the perfect storm of high cost and high emotion. And that's one of the things that really excites me about this aspect of overall financial planning, because it is so gratifying to work with families on retirement planning and buying homes. But you know, I'm the parent of a high school junior, so now I'm doing this live and in person myself, and I am experiencing firsthand what a lot of my clients and Elevate clients have experienced for years, and that is the anxiousness and the sense of obligation to equip our children for success in life, and what equips children for success in life better than education, but it is so expensive. So let's talk today about how to make it affordable and a good investment, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? And so if there's one thing that you walk away from this presentation with, I hope it will be this, and that is ignore US News and World Report. If you're familiar with the magazine College Rankings, they are the go-to for so many people because they've marketed the heck out of that thing. But what we find is that college rankings lead people down the wrong paths often. And we'll discuss today that there really are two main paths to college planning, depending on your income and assets. So middle class and above folks need to follow one path, which we'll talk about in a moment. And those of more modest income and assets should actually follow an entirely different path to find colleges that are a good fit academically, emotionally, extracurricularly, and financially. So as Deanne said, you have an outline. Those of you attending live and those of you watching the recording, it is our hope that the outline will free you up from taking notes and also be a resource to you going forward, because we've included a lot of great links to additional information and helpful tools in there. So I hope you'll make good use of that. And by the way, I have a lot of formal remarks, but I like these sessions to be interactive. So please chime in the chat with questions, and we will have time at the end, but I welcome them throughout. So I'll start out with step one of college planning being to determine what your expected family contribution is. And that's a technical term in this business, often abbreviated EFC. And the EFC is very simply the minimum amount that most colleges will expect you to pay. Some colleges will expect you to pay more, unfortunately, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There's a great website, and again, this is all in the outline, a great website at collegeboard.org that has an online calculator to help families estimate what their EFC is. And I strongly encourage families, whether your child is still in diapers, middle school, high school, run your EFC so that you can be prepared and plan accordingly for what colleges will expect you to pay. I'd also like to warn people to be sitting down when they run that, because it can be a shocking number. And again, that goes back to the high cost aspect of college planning. And we're going to talk about how to mitigate that high cost and an EFC that may not seem realistic to some folks. So when you can run the EFC at any time in your child's pre-college years, but when it comes to your child's senior year of high school, you will actually have to complete financial aid applications. And there are two main financial aid applications. One's called the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, and the other is called the Css Profile, a little lesser known application that is used by only about 200 mostly private schools around the country, as well as a few public schools that give out some of their own grants and scholarships. Those include University of North Carolina, University of Virginia, and University of Michigan, I believe, are the only three public undergraduate schools that require the CSS profile. And so the FAFSA determines your eligibility for federal grants and loans. And I encourage everyone to complete the FAFSA, regardless of your income and assets. Even if you don't think you're going to qualify, I get that question a lot. Should I even bother? I'm not going to get any grants or scholarships. And I still recommend to most people, at least during the student's freshman year, complete the FAFSA, because some schools actually use data in the FAFSA to distribute their own aid. And so you can be leaving free money on the table or even low-cost loans on the table. Because not only low-cost loans from the school, but definitely the first line of attack for borrowing for college are those federal loans, because they are at historically low interest rates. with very flexible repayment options. So if you're going to borrow for some of college, the federal direct student loan, as it's called, is one of the best lines of first line of attack. As I said, the CSS profile is required by some private schools and a few public schools. The profile, the reason for the profile is, since those schools are giving out their own aid, they like to dig a little deeper. It is possible to trick FAFSA by shuffling money from one pocket to another. You can make yourself look more needy, so to speak. And need is an actual term, so I'm not just using that in an offhanded way. Need is a technical term in college planning, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the CSS profile asks a few more questions than the FAFSA and digs a little deeper. You can find out, again, in the outline, you'll see that there is a link to a list of schools that require the CSS profile. So don't worry about finding that. It's readily available right there on the College Board website. Hand in hand with determining your EFC is, if you know of a few schools or have already started cultivating a list of schools that you might be interested in, there's something called a net price calculator on every college's website. And that is sort of the custom EFC for that school based on your income and assets. And sometimes those net price calculators actually will ask about your students, your child's test scores and GPA. The more questions they ask about that sort of thing, the more reliable the net price calculator is. And I should back up and say it's the net price calculator. So it's easy to find out what the sticker price is of a school, but most people actually don't pay full price for college. It's kind of like an airline ticket. If you're in the middle seat and ask the person to your right and left what they paid, it's very likely that they paid something different from you. Although now in today's COVID world, I don't know if they're packing people in right, left, and center anymore. So maybe that is no longer accurate. I will say that we'll talk about it in a moment, some changes that are being instituted with federal aid and that EFC in the 2023-2024 school year. That EFC will be renamed to something called the Student Aid Index. Don't have to worry about that today, but I'm just making you aware of that. For those of you whose children are younger, EFC will never be an issue for you, and this new thing called the Student Aid Index will be if your student is not college bound until the mid-2020s. So a really important formula that I like to make people aware of is, it's very simple: cost of a school minus your EFC equals your need. And there's that need word that I mentioned before. And so let's just put that in perspective for a moment. Let's say you ran that EFC calculator on the College Board website and found out that you had an EFC of $40,000, for example. And I'm talking to a bunch of folks in Georgia, so I decided to use Emory University in this example, as well as UG. And so Emory has an all-in sticker price of $76,000. So using the formula, cost minus EFC, so $76,000 cost minus a $40,000 EFC leaves you with $36,000 of need. Conversely, if a Georgia resident applied to University of Georgia and was admitted, and that same family still had an EFC of $40,000, University of Georgia cost, if my numbers are correct from looking at it yesterday, is about $28,000 all in. So that formula, again, of cost minus need, 28,000 minus 40 leaves a family with no need. So it's unlikely that a family would get any need-based aid, or this family with the $40,000 EFC, unlikely that they would get any need-based aid at University of Georgia. One more example, if that same family from Georgia decided to send their child to, say, University of Florida, so they're going to pay non-resident rates. Out of state, University of Florida, all in is about $44,000. So 44 minus the EFC of 40 leaves one with $4,000 of need. So at Emory University, $36,000 of need. At University of Georgia, zero need. At University of Florida, $4,000 of need. And that's where the schools start looking at how much are we going to give a student to get them to come, because $76,000 is not laying in too many folks' couch cushions. I know it's not in my couch cushions. So schools like Emory have a policy of meeting 100% of need for admitted students. So most folks admitted to Emory only have to pay their EFC, but there's a practice that's only possible at very well-off schools that have large endowments and devote a significant portion of that endowment to need-based aid. That's very few schools, and we'll talk about the schools that do have that policy in a moment. Most schools don't, and so there's the more common practice is called gapping. So gapping means not only are you on the hook for your $40,000 EFC in this example, but you, for instance, at University of Florida, you might also be on the hook for that. They might not give you any aid, so you'd be on the hook for the additional $4,000 of their sticker price. And the thing that I want to make people aware of is that many people, perhaps on this call, many middle class and above folks have EFCs way higher than $40,000. In fact, they may have an expected family contribution in the neighborhood of $60,000 or even $80,000 or more, which is more than the cost of the most expensive schools in the country today. And so the takeaway then with that formula of cost minus EFC equals need is many well-off families have no need and will receive no need-based aid. And that's what leads to these two paths for well-off families. What colleges should they look for to increase the chances of merit aid as opposed to need-based aid? And more modestly income and asset families who will qualify for some need-based aid, and which schools are generous with need-based aid. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. So for those families with low EFCs, i.e. modest or low income, modest or low assets, there are those schools, and this is a technical term in the business, so if you're doing your homework, I would encourage you to remember schools that meet 100% of need, or it's called a meets need school. And the holy grail of those schools is those schools that do so without loans, because it's one thing to bridge the gap with loans, but really all you're doing in a situation like that is kicking the can down the street, because those loans do have to be repaid eventually. And so, as I said, it's very few schools that meet 100% of need. Some examples are Amherst, University of Chicago, Davidson, MIT, Pomona, Stanford, Swarthmore, and most of the Ivy League schools, i.e. some of the most selective schools in the country. Some other schools that have the same practice, but set an income threshold. So they'll meet 100% of the need for families below certain income levels. Cornell University, for example, says that they'll meet 100% of need for families with less than $60,000 of income. Dartmouth sets the level at $100,000. Some other schools in this group are Colgate, Duke, Tufts, Rice, UNC. And so if you are someone with a low EFC, say $20,000 or less, it's all relative, but that's sort of a ballpark figure, you really ought to look at these schools because they are, if you get into these schools, all you're going to be on the hook for is your EFC. Unfortunately, well-off families are likely to pay full price at those schools. The schools that we just talked about devote most of their aid to need-based aid because, candidly, the schools we just talked about have plenty of families, plenty of well-off families that are willing to pay full price or more to send their kids there, as we've seen in the California admissions scandal recently, where we saw families willing to pay 6 figures just to get their kid into the school and then willing to pay full price once they got there. So that brings us to the strategy for families middle class or higher. And unfortunately, even middle class families need to, even middle class families who may feel that their income and assets don't put them in at a high level, have to take a little different path when it comes to cultivating that list of schools. And so you want to look for schools that are generous with merit aid. And there's actually a great study by an organization called the National Association of College and University Business Officers. They study something called tuition discounting. And they study it for private schools because private schools are the ones that engage in this practice called tuition discounting much more than public schools do. And what they find is, just like I alluded to earlier, the plane ticket analogy, that the average price paid at private schools today is 50%, it's actually less than 50% of sticker price. So the tuition discounting, a technical term, is maybe the sticker price is 80, but the average student pays less than $40,000. Now that's somebody who knows how to play the game. Some of that discount is need-based aid, but some of it is also merit-based aid. So for many Elevate clients or others with good income and assets, they need to look at these schools that have the wherewithal to engage in tuition discounting. Schools are, it's easy to find, back a moment ago, it's easy to find schools that have this policy of meeting 100% of need. They publicize that quite widely. Schools that are generous with merit aid play it a little closer to the vest, honestly. So it's a little more difficult to find, but in the outline, there are some resources, 3 websites, in fact, called Merit More, Admit, and collegedata.com that do a nice job of helping families search for merit generous schools. And so how would a family position itself to qualify for merit aid? Honestly, it's as simple as finding schools where your student is among the top 25% of applicants. So let's be frank. Unless your student has scored a 1600 on the SAT and a perfect 36 on the ACT, they are likely to be in the middle of the pack of applicants at the Ivies, Emory, and some of the others that we mentioned earlier. Frankly, you're going to have, if you're not scoring 1636 on the standardized tests with a 4+ GPA and 17 AP classes, you need to look at schools off the beaten path. and I'm just going to tell it like it is and say that these are schools that are slightly less selective than some of the schools we've mentioned so far, but still fine schools, honestly. And we'll talk in a moment why I feel strongly and others in the college planning business feel strongly that students can receive excellent preparation, possibly even better preparation for success and happiness in life at these lesser known schools than at the name brand schools. We'll talk about that in a moment. Their studies have been done on this very topic. And there's a widely studied phenomenon called the big fish, little pond effect. Kind of self-explanatory. You could, if you were a very science-oriented person or technologically oriented person, you might think MIT, or maybe in your area, Georgia Tech. And so MIT is probably one of the foremost places for technology and science. Going there, very few people are going to be the leader of the pack. It's going to be the best of the best that are the leader of the pack. Others will be little fish in that big pond. That is MIT is a big pond. Here in Missouri, we have a school somewhat like Georgia Tech. It's called Missouri University for Science and Technology. A fine school just like Georgia Tech, but maybe a place where a student could shine a bit more than they could at a place like MIT. And so the study of this big fish, little pond effect has found that maybe you can get into MIT, but the intense competition, if that's not who you are, can be somewhat demoralizing over time, and has even derailed some folks. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell, in his book David and Goliath, wrote about this very topic. He profiled a young woman who just really excelled in science throughout high school, and her final choice of colleges came down to Brown University in Rhode Island and University of Maryland. Both fine schools. I think we all might put Brown a notch above Maryland, and so she chose the quote better school. And just like the studies have found, that attending, for some folks, attending the most rigorous, most selective, competitive school you can get into, her science aspirations were derailed because she felt inadequate compared to her stellar peers. And had she gone to University of Maryland, she would have been a bigger fish in that pond and might not have been as discouraged and might have continued to pursue her science education. And actually, I was writing an article on this for a publication called thestreet.com, which you can find. And I was curious to see at the University of Maryland, how many professors, I think she was in chemistry, how many professors had Ivy League or similar backgrounds. And lo and behold, at the University of Maryland, roughly 50% of the faculty in her department came from Ivy League or similar backgrounds. And so it really made it hit home to me that you can find spectacular educations at schools that don't have the brand name prestige of the Ivies. And it made it hit home to me that you really do need to look under the hood of schools to see what you're getting into, because a good school in one department might not be a good school in another department, and vice versa. Maryland has a spectacular chemistry department and many other spectacular departments. And you can get a great education, especially if you're a Maryland resident, at University of Maryland. The same can be said for many of you folks watching this today. There's plenty of fantastic schools and even and wonderful departments within those schools at many Georgia public institutions. And we'll talk in a moment about the pros and cons of attending in-state versus out-of-state. Another thing I wanted to make folks aware of is a study by Gallup, the pollster, that found that the keys to confidence, to graduates' confidence for professional success there were 6 keys. And those were students that felt that they had caring professors who made learning exciting, and also found mentorship either with professors or in the career development office. They also had opportunities to do long-term internships or projects in their field of interest and significant extracurricular involvement. And so again, I go back to, say, MIT versus Georgia Tech. The competition for those enrichment opportunities at a place like MIT, I think it's fair to say, will be more intense than it might be at Georgia Tech or my home school of Missouri Science and Technology. And so attending a slightly less selective, but still fine school like Georgia Tech and Missouri Science and Technology can make you eligible and can make those enrichment opportunities more available to you. And they really, as Gallup found, are the keys to taking a good education to a great education, good career preparation to great career preparation. And secondarily, a secondary benefit of that is that merit aid is much more likely at slightly less selective schools. And so not only are you likely to get a great education and great career prep, but the cost is likely to be lower too. I'll conclude this section by making a comment too about the difference between research universities versus teaching colleges. So Harvard and Yale are often batted around as the top 2 schools in the country. But who's likely to teach undergraduates at Harvard and Yale? It's not those stellar professors that make the school's reputation. Often at schools like that, the people teaching your freshmen are teaching assistants. And so I just really have to ask myself and clients when they're thinking about writing a check, again, well-off families are going to pay full price at schools like that and Emory and others. Are you happy paying full price to have your freshman and sophomore taught by teaching assistants, or would you feel like you were getting more for your money if you actually sent your child to a school where they're going to be taught by full professors? And as a result of attending a slightly less selective school, taught by full professors at a lower cost than the school where they're being taught by teaching assistants. Just something to be aware of. Another few other quick remarks on that topic. Again, this topic has been studied in depth, and there's actually 2 researchers named Dale and Kruger who did a study and then actually replicated it a time or two to verify that their conclusions were still accurate. Their study was called Estimating the Return to College Selectivity, and they studied students who got into some of the most selective schools in the country. That was one group, and attended those selective schools. And they compared that group to another group of students that also got into those most selective schools in the country, but for one reason or another, chose to go to slightly less selective schools. And they looked at the earnings of those 2 groups 10 years down the road after graduation. And they found that for most graduates, the earnings of the 2 groups were identical. There were a couple of differences for first gen college students and some minority students, where the selectivity, maybe the networking opportunities that were offered at the more selective schools did give them some slight leg up than if they had attended the slightly less selective schools. But honestly, even in those cases, the differences were minor. So and lastly, there's a great book on this topic. If you're not into reading academic journal articles, the book is called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be by Frank Bruni. And I cannot recommend that book highly enough. I recommend it to all the families that I work with, especially those who, as I like to say, maybe they've drunk the Kool-Aid that I call Yale or jail, Harvard or homeless. There are a lot of folks out there who think that if they don't send their kids to the most prestigious brand name school that they can possibly get into, that they've crippled their child for life. And that's just the furthest thing from the truth. And this book, Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, really opens eyes to that fact, and I think emboldens people to look off the beaten path, like I talked about earlier. So what are some strategies to manage one's EFC? The biggest variables, so if there are ways to reduce your EFC and thereby increase your eligibility for aid, you want to do so. So the biggest variables in one's EFC are income and assets. Simple as that. Not only the parents' income and assets, but the students. And the income that matters, there's something called the base year. And that base year corresponds to second semester, sophomore year of high school, first semester, junior year of high school, because that's a calendar year. And so you want to, once your student is in that year, that's your income year that will determine your student's freshman year financial aid eligibility. Assets don't matter until the day you sign the application. And so strategies to reduce one's EFC are paying down debt, accelerating planned expenses. If you were going to do a home renovation anyway, do it before you sign the EFC rather than after. Keeping in mind that only non-retirement accounts count on the FAFSA, as well as the other financial aid application, the Css Profile. Home equity is also excluded on the FAFSA, but it is included on the Css Profile. Good news, many schools cap the amount of home equity that they will assess. So not all of your home equity will count against you. The other strategies to manage one's EFC is deferring income. If you are self-employed and have the ability to put off income from that base year, especially, even though you have to reapply for aid every year, deferring income in that base year can be especially powerful. Funding retirement accounts, obviously, because as I said, the retirement accounts are ignored on both financial aid applications. A very powerful way to reduce one's EFC is to spend down or transfer students' assets, perhaps from the student to the parent. The parent assets are assessed at about 5%, whereas student assets are assessed at about 20% on the FAFSA and even higher on the Css Profile. So as you can imagine, that spread between 5% and 20 or 25%, if you can magically move assets from the student to the parent, you've saved a big chunk right there. A lot of families might have custodial accounts. Maybe a grandparent or parent has opened a custodial account for their child. One of the most common things that we'll do for families is take that custodial account and move those dollars into a 529 account, and magically those assets are transformed from a student asset to a parent asset. And the EFC goes down dramatically as a result. You can gift money to grandparents, and who could then fund a 529 account for the child. I'd like to also tell you one way not to try to reduce your EFC. You may read articles or be approached by folks selling annuities and life insurance. It definitely will reduce your assets, but it often doesn't help much in the EFC area, and really ends up a net loser in many cases. So on the CSS profile, there are some different rules, and I'll just touch on those briefly because I want to leave some time for Q&A. As I said, that the CSS profile assesses student assets at a little higher rate. The CSS profile will look at all 529 accounts on which the student is a beneficiary, whereas the FAFSA just asks the parent only, what 529 accounts do you have for the child? And then there's even a regional cost of living adjustment, maybe not as crucial there in Georgia, but I know that clients on the coasts often want to know that their higher cost of living is being factored into their EFC. So, and lastly, I'll say, before engaging in all of these strategies, though, go back to that College Board EFC calculator and tinker with some of your, like, run some what if scenarios to see, will this strategy of perhaps moving dollars out of my child's name and into my name, will that really move the needle on my EFC enough to make a difference? Because if it doesn't, then there's really no point. Will paying down my mortgage move the needle enough to reduce my EFC? Because again, if it won't move the needle, then there's really no point in doing it. Unfortunately, I'd like to talk briefly about divorce situations, because unfortunately that is a fact of life, and there are some rules and strategies there. Families need to be aware of the fact that in a divorce situation, when one remarries, the step parents' income and assets will be required on the financial aid applications. In the case of the CSS profile, but in the case of the FAFSA, I will say that that's the case, that the step parents' income and assets are required. Most CSS profile schools require both parents' information, and you can again find that for sure on the College Board website. And finally, there are some rules changing in this regard. In 2022 and beyond, I'm sorry, let me change that. For until 2024, the FAFSA requires just the custodial parents' financial information. So let me make that clear, since I stumbled over that, I apologize. Currently, when you fill out the FAFSA, if you're divorced, only the parent with whom the child lives more than 50% of the time must file their income and assets on the FAFSA. It doesn't matter what the divorce decree says about joint custody or anything like that. It just matters where the child lives more than 50% of the time. That parent needs to put their income and assets on the FAFSA. The other parent does not. In the 2024-2025 school year and beyond, that changes. And the parent who will have to complete the FAFSA is the one that is providing the most support. Regardless of where the student lives, if the student lives with dad, but mom provides most of the support, mom has to put her income and assets on the FAFSA and vice versa. And so that can be detrimental, because in many cases, the person providing the most support has higher income and assets. So this change is being criticized by some as because it's likely going to increase many families' EFCs. Just a few concluding remarks that I'd like to go over. COVID has introduced a lot of changes, obviously, to anybody with students in school knows this, but it's especially true in the college realm. A lot of schools are going test optional. There were a lot of schools already that didn't feel that the SAT or ACT were really reflective of students' long-term college success, but that's picking up steam even more. And because being in a classroom with a bunch of other kids on a Saturday morning, taking an SAT or ACT is just not in the cards for a lot of folks. A lot of schools are going test optional, and there's a great website called fairtest.org that lists all of the schools that are test optional. So a lot of students who maybe don't test so well can use that to their advantage. I will say that those test optional schools grant admission without the ACT or the SAT, but they don't always grant merit aid. So you can get in without your test scores, but if you're gunning for some scholarships or grants, your test scores might be necessary. I will also say that with the common application, more and more people are applying to more and more schools, which is resulting in lower acceptance rates. The colleges love this because it makes them look more selective. But you can apply to 20 schools or 30 schools, but you can only attend one school. So I really encourage parents and students not to let the low acceptance rates scare them, because it's really a symptom of the same or a similar number of students just applying to more schools. A lot of students are taking gap years, especially last year. We'll see how this year shakes out. It seems to be a closer to normal year at many schools, but with the Delta variant, who knows how the full year is going to pan out. And many families just decided, you know what, I think a gap year made sense even before COVID, and it makes a lot even more sense now, just to have my student do something, to pursue an interest, do something worthwhile during this year, and then go to college the next year. And you can always apply to a school, get in, defer your admission for a year. There's a formal way to do that at many schools, and just say, hey, thank you for admitting me. I would like to defer my admission for a year while I pursue this job, internship, research opportunity, whatever. And so that's an increasingly common thing for folks to do. Lastly, on this topic, I'll say that once you complete the financial aid applications and get your aid award letter from each school that you were admitted to, that is not the final offer. Many families look at that and say, and just assume that that's the final offer. But it's often not, especially in today's COVID environment and with many schools increasingly struggling to fill their classes. There's a process called professional judgment review, and a great book called How to Appeal for More Financial Aid, again, in the outline, so don't worry about writing it down. A gentleman named Mark Kantrowitz wrote the book How to Appeal for More Financial Aid, and I really highly recommend that book to families who get that aid award letter and want to explore going back to the school and asking for more grants, scholarships, et cetera. There's a secondary source called Tuition Fit that allows you to see what other families like you, in other words, other families with similar assets, similar income, paid in the past at the schools that you're looking at. So I encourage a lot of folks that this is really a great tool. When you get your aid award letter, you can go to tuitionfit.org and see, is your aid award competitive with what families like you have received in the past? If not, then you really probably do have a leg to stand on to go back to the school and say, hey, let's talk about this. And I always encourage very, diplomatic, please and thank you, because these financial aid officers are being bombarded, especially today, with requests, and they're not always the nicest, they're not always nicely phrased requests. And so now I just wanted to conclude with some of those law changes that I mentioned earlier, that the EFC will be renamed the Student Aid Index as of the 24-25 school year. We talked about the divorce changes previously. Up until the 24-25 school year, some of you may have heard that grandparent-owned 529 accounts can be detrimental to need-based aid, and that is true. But that detrimental impact goes away as of the 24-25 school year. So if any of you parents have your parents that are saving for your children, they can the students won't attend school until 24-25 or later, they can rest assured that their efforts won't have any impact on need-based aid if you are eligible for need-based aid. And finally, one of the biggest law changes is currently, let's just go back to my earlier EFC example of $40,000. If you had one student in school and your EFC were $40,000, you would be expected to pay at least $40,000. Currently, if you have two students in school and your EFC is 40, you're not expected to pay 80, not expected to pay 40 for each child. You're actually, under current law, that EFC of 40 is divided by 2. And if you have 3 kids in school, it's divided by 3, and so on and so forth, at least as far as the FAFSA goes. The Css Profile is a little less generous, but still similar. In the 23-24 school year, that's the last year of this discount. In 24-25 and beyond, if your EFC is 40 and you have 2 children, you will be the EFC will not be split in half, it will be multiplied by 2. If you have 3 kids, your EFC of 40 will be multiplied by 3. This is one of the most controversial changes, as you can imagine, and it's really derailing a lot of parents' college planning. But I'm here to just make you aware of it as far in advance as possible so that you can take that into account, and it may change the schools that end up on your final list of applications. Finally, I'll say that COVID has stressed out a lot of families. It's also stressed out a lot of colleges. And some colleges were living tuition check to tuition check even before COVID. Now it's even worse. And so colleges are going out of business, not in droves, but there's a lot of colleges that when you do look under the hood, you'll see that, like I said, they're living tuition check to tuition check, and maybe they're not in danger of closing, but they've already cut back, or your student could end up on campus and then in their sophomore year, the department or the extracurricular activity that drew them gets cut. And so I encourage families to look under the hood of colleges, not only at the teachers and the graduation rates, but also at their financial health. And again, in the outline, there's a few great resources, one called collegeviability.com. Admit, that I mentioned earlier, has a great resource. There's 2 others, Forbes magazine and the Hechinger report, give a lot of insight into colleges' financial health. And last but not least, I mentioned it just a moment ago, graduation rates. It's almost shameful what some graduation rates are at some schools, and often through no fault of the student. It's just a symptom of the school not offering the necessary number of classes at the proper times for students to get through in 4 years. And so I really encourage families to look at graduation rates when considering schools. And unfortunately, graduation rates are often reported as 6-year graduation rates, and believe it or not, even 8-year graduation rates. And I don't know about you, but I wasn't planning on sending my daughter to college for 6 or 8 years. And so, buyer beware when you're looking at graduation rates. Really know what you're looking at. Is it 4 years, 6, or 8? And in the outline, I give you 3 great resources: collegeresults.org, College Navigator, and College Scorecard, that can help you figure out whether you're going to a school that has this problem or doesn't have the problem. And you can really plan ahead by the moment your student sets foot on campus. Meet with their academic advisor, map out not just the first year, but at least put it in pencil on paper what the next 4 years are going to look like, so that you can be sure that you're not on the hook for a 9th semester or even on an entire 5th year that could make an already costly undertaking even more costly. So those are my formal remarks. Like I said, happy to take questions. I really appreciate your time and attention. And I'll just say that I collaborate with Elevate and a lot of other advisors. So if you have a question that you're not comfortable asking here live and in person, don't hesitate to chat with Deanne or Betsy, and we'll get your questions answered.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was fascinating. And I can see how this can benefit not just parents of current high school seniors and juniors, but really children of any age, to really plan ahead and look at especially how these laws are changing in the future.
Yeah.
We do have some questions. The first one is, should we contribute to the grandparents' 529 instead of our own? And are there other implications we consider when doing that?
Yeah. So again, going back to the elimination of that grandparent penalty, so to speak, in the 24-25 school year, there were already ways to mitigate that grandparent penalty by postponing a withdrawal from a grandparent 529 until the last 5 semesters of one's college experience, assuming a typical 4-year experience. Because the way the financial aid applications work, if you don't withdraw from that grandparent account until the last 5 semesters, then the withdrawal never hurts you. Happy to go into more detail, but suffice to say that. Now that for students who won't be attending college until 2024 and beyond, that's gone. And yeah, it could make a lot of sense. I'm not in the business of breaking any rules. All of this is strictly legal. It's just a matter, it's like I said earlier, by shuffling money from one pocket to another, you can make yourself more eligible for aid. And yeah, I think, Betsy, the short answer to the question is, it can make a lot of sense. But again, run the EFC calculator to see, is that really going to move the needle? Are you on the cusp of being eligible for need-based aid or not? Is your EFC $150,000 and therefore no amount of shuffling money is going to make a difference?
That makes sense. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in that Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll get those to Dave. There's another one. What determines whether a school gives generous merit aid, and where can I find the schools that do?
Yeah. So what determines it is, going back to the list of schools that I mentioned early on that are generous with need-based aid, those schools have more than enough well-off families applying that they don't have to offer merit aid. They devote most of their aid to need. So what determines whether a school offers generous merit aid is, do they have enough families applying, or do they have to engage in that discounting? And discounting and merit aid, it's the same thing. They're just different. One's a euphemism for the other. And so are they looking to attract more students and compete with the Ivies and Emory and others? And do they have the endowment to support it? Where you can find those schools is those websites that I mentioned, called Merit More, Admit, and collegedata.com. All have great features on their websites that allow you to see what a school's historic merit aid practices were, how many students received merit aid, and what was the average award. And again, these are all averages. So if your child is among the top 25% of applicants at the school, they're likely to get above average merit aid. And so that's really key, is to know, is my child one that this school is willing to pay to attract?
Very good. And I did put the links to those websites in the chat box in case you don't have your hand out handy. The next one is, are private scholarship programs worthwhile? If so, where can I find them?
Yeah. So I would say that the strategies we talked about looking for schools where your student will be competitive, there's the amount of tuition discounting or merit aid, again, same thing. The amount of discounting to be had is far greater using that strategy than many private scholarships. You know, we hear about the full ride Coca-Cola scholarship, but that's like a lottery ticket, candidly. It's not common. And so I think that finding schools where your student will be competitive will reap far more rewards. I don't want to discourage folks from trying. If there's a scholarship that just has your name written all over it, and you check all the boxes, then by all means. And there's some great databases of those, FastWeb, College Board again, Peterson's, and a website called scholarships.com. One caveat: there's this thing called scholarship displacement. So if my EFC is $40,000, again, going back to that earlier example, and I happen to get a $3,000 private scholarship from FastWeb, well, suddenly I have $3,000 that I didn't have before, and my need goes down. My EFC goes up. Some schools will look at that and say, yeah, that we gave you a $10,000 grant, but now that you got this other $3,000, we're reducing our grant from 10 to 7. It doesn't happen everywhere, but I do hear from some families that my child wrote an essay, went through an interview process, and net, we didn't come out ahead. So just be aware that perhaps ask the schools that you're applying for, do they engage in scholarship displacement?
Okay, very good information. If a school's reputation is not the most important factor, what other criteria should we be looking for?
Yeah, so I just really go back to that Gallup study of internship opportunities, professor interaction, mentorship, career guidance. Some folks attend college to expand their minds. Most of us, though, I think we're sending our kids to school to prepare them for success in the real world. So there's got to be some ROI here. And the things that I just mentioned in the Gallup study really increase the ROI, the return on that investment. Again, my concluding remarks about graduation rate, I can't emphasize that highly enough. It's not something families look at enough. The financial strength of a school. Another characteristic that I didn't mention is collegedata.com and some other websites do a nice job of showing how many freshmen return for their sophomore year. And if that's a low number, that's an alarm bell. And today's day and age, we can't disregard safety, support, mental health, physical health support on campus. And so look at those things. I think those are some lesser known things that should really be considered.
Very good. Are scholarships taxable income to the student?
Yeah, that is one, that's a complicated one. I believe that, I don't want to shoot from the hip on this one. I think that scholarships that are used for anything but tuition can be assessed as taxable income, but I really don't want to steer anybody wrong. So can I get back to you on that?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And then this last one, this is applicable really here in Georgia. We have the Hope Scholarship, which is fantastic. And we also have the Zell Miller. It makes it very enticing for students to stay here in Georgia, but we do have a lot of families that their kids want to go out of state. Those non-resident costs are so high. What are some ways that we can mitigate those costs of going out of state?
Yeah, so yeah, I have to ask folks here in Missouri who want to send their kids to Indiana and pay twice the cost of Missouri. The same question. Many states have what's called tuition reciprocity. And in the case of Georgia, forgive me while I look at my list here so I make sure I get it right. There's 12 states that have reciprocity with Georgia, and those are Alabama, Arkansas, Delaware, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. Not every school, and not even every program or department within every school. So there's something called the Southern Regional Education Board, sreb.org, where you can find more information on this to see, is the school I'm looking at in one of these other states, do they engage in tuition reciprocity, and does the department that my child is probably going to major in qualify and participate? Aside from that, if there's no merit aid to be had, there's so many fine schools within Georgia, and especially when there's multiple children, I just have to, again, ask myself about the ROI on attending school out of state.
Okay, excellent. And then we do have one last question. And could you clarify the new rules regarding the multiple student discount? If we use a calculator, should we ignore the number of students in college field and plan that each child will have the same EFC, or will the calculation be adjusted when this rule is implemented?
Yeah, so that EFC calculator that I mentioned on the College Board website, the College Board is well aware of these law changes, but today's EFC calculator on the College Board website doesn't take into account the rule change if your student will be a college student in 2024 and beyond. So I think that when you're estimating your EFC on the College Board website, if your student is not even in high school yet and will be hit by this new rule, then just know that if your EFC comes back as $40,000, but you have twins, many schools are going to expect you to pay $80,000.
Okay. Those are all our questions. We do have one comment that band, athletic, military can also reduce your out-of-state fee as well. So that is a really great point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good. Well, this has just been wonderful. I really appreciate it. And if you guys have any additional questions, please email them to me and I'll make sure that Dave gets them. And that's Betsy.Reeves, REEVES at elevate-wealth.com. And I'll make sure he gets them. And also, if you need a copy of the handout, please email me and I'll make sure you get that as well. Deanne, do you want to close us out?
I'd love to. Dave, so informative, such a great session today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll ask one final question of you. And we've been talking up to this point about planning and the financial contribution and a lot of parent-focused items. My question to you is, when do we start talking to our student about this?
Fantastic. And I'm sorry I didn't address that. Yeah, I think that as soon as they start talking to them, as soon as they understand what a dollar is, honestly. I started having these conversations with my daughter probably a little later than that, but it really helps to start talking so that they understand that paying, if writing a check for $80,000 is not in the cards for a family, then not every school is an option. And so just setting the framework that this is a financial decision like buying a car is, and we wouldn't send our child to the car dealership with a blank check. We're not going to send them college shopping with a blank check either. And so as soon as they understand what a dollar is and start taking interest in college, I think is a great time. And I often encourage families, if the student will read any of the books that I mentioned, especially Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, or if the parent can just read passages to the student so that they understand that I can be successful, and many people quoted in the book have been wildly successful attending schools that some of us may have never heard of, frankly.
Yeah, agreed. You've given us so many great resources today to use as parents and with our children. I had a client yesterday who told me that her daughter just started in high school. She's a freshman this year, and they've already talked about it. And the student herself is already thinking about the financial implications of college. And that's really what you want to be. When you talk about this decision being highly emotional, a lot of the time it's highly emotional because the student has their heart set on somewhere that maybe our EFC just isn't where we want it to be for that school. So thank you for those comments. Thank you for all of the great information you shared today. We appreciate having you on. Thank you also to Betsy, Betsy Reeves, our marketing coordinator, for coordinating this webinar today. We really appreciate all of your effort in that. And as she mentioned, if you have any questions or would like to follow up with us, Betsy has posted her email into the chat box. Feel free to reach out to us anytime. And if we need to, we can connect you with Dave as well. And please join us for our next webinar. We do these webinars monthly, and we hope to provide educational topics that are timely and relevant to you and your financial situation. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Go dogs.
Go dogs.
Bye.